those from afar. We've had some wonderful visitors from around the world. So if anybody wants to type in the chat where they're joining us from, we would love to know. Okay, we've got people from all over: Iraq, San Francisco, West Sussex, England, Columbia, Maryland, Denver, Colorado, San Diego. Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody. We're just going to give it one more minute, and then we're going to get started. We're seeing lots of people from all over the place. Baltimore City, Berkeley, California, Dewey Beach, Delaware, State College, Pennsylvania. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. And it is just 1 o'clock now. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome to our Friday Virtual Histories program. My name is Molly Ricks, and I am with Baltimore Heritage. In 2020, Baltimore Heritage and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation partnered to host these virtual histories every other Friday. So a few announcements before we start. First, I want to thank anyone who donated to be here with us today. Your support enables us to continue talks like these, so thank you. And in 2 weeks, our virtual histories talk will be on the evolution of Sudbrook Park, a planned community in Northwest Baltimore designed in 1889 by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. And so we'll hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks. And now for today's presentation, Sarah Grossberg has a BA in Art History from Virginia Tech and an MA in Historic Preservation from the George Washington University. She's an architectural historian with the Maryland Environmental Service and MDOT, State Highway Administration, and a board member of the Friends of the Ship Caulkers Houses and the Preservation Society. Sarah, thank you for being here. And during the presentation, if anyone has any questions, please add them to the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. And with that, take it away, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay, let me share my screen here. And Molly, can you confirm that you're seeing the
Yes, it looks
the
great.
right thing here? Okay, great, thank you. I am excited to be here today with you, and thank you all for joining us and listening to me share this important story that's a great part of Baltimore's history. Talking about the ship caulkers and one specific caulker, Israel Jones. Before I get started, I want to just tell you a little bit about the ship caulkers houses themselves. They're owned by the Society for the Preservation of Federal Hill and Fells Point, the Preservation Society, since 2005. The Preservation Society tasked the Friends of the Ship Caulkers Houses, which is also a nonprofit organization, to stabilize and rehabilitate the houses, to tell the story of the ship caulkers, and to find a sustainable permanent use for the houses. So we started the stabilization work in 2020 after receiving an African American History and Heritage Preservation Grant that's administered by the Maryland Historical Trust and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And so this, and in 2021, then we've actually started on the, I guess last year, 2021, we started on the stabilization of the houses, which is being completed by CNH Restoration and Renovation. And this phase includes stabilizing the houses so they can stand on their own. Right now, there are some internal supports that were added in the late 2000s. And also it will make the buildings weather tight. And we've been fundraising for a second phase that will allow us to add period appropriate finishes to the houses, siding, windows, doors, roofing. I want to say thank you to Baltimore City. We received a grant thanks to Councilperson Z. Cohen from the Department of Housing and Community Development. And also excited to announce that Just this week, the Maryland legislature sent an appropriations bill to Governor Hogan for signing, which would give us $200,000 from the local legislative bond initiative that will fund the next phase and allow us to complete the exterior work. And just want to say a thank you to Senator Bill Ferguson and delegates for Clearman, Luke Clippinger, and Robert Lewis, and of course also all their staff for their support of our project. And we're continuing to fundraise because once that exterior is done, we still have the interior rehabilitation that needs to take place. So the houses themselves are unique architecturally. They're rare surviving examples of what was once a common architectural type found on the Eastern Seaboard. And here you can see we have this rendering that was completed by one of the Friends Group members, Arnold Caputi, showing what they would have looked like on the left. That 614 and 612 are on the left-hand side, and 614 was the end of the row, but it actually was a longer row of houses and probably two groups of four each. And so they spanned all the way up to the end of the street. On the right, you see there, it's a Sanborn fire insurance map that I put in where the houses are, but you can see that row of houses that was still mostly extant by the end of the 19th century, but soon after that, many of them were replaced with the current buildings. So that's important, but the focus of a lot of what we do is on the ship caulkers. The houses were inhabited by a lot of different people in the 19th and 20th centuries, but most importantly, in the 1840s and 1850s, they were lived in by Black ship caulkers that worked in Fells Point. Baltimore was a huge shipbuilding industry. It was a big part of the economy, and they were a crucial part of that. If you're not familiar, ship caulking, that's the process of making the boats watertight. So they would do that by inserting oakum, which was a kind of a rope fibers in between the boards. Those would be covered by pitch or hot tar, and then covered with metal. So the subject of my talk today, Israel Jones, he was a ship caulker living in Baltimore, born around 1800. And it seems that he was free most of his life, if not all of it. We don't have a lot of information yet on his early life, but we do know that he was working as a caulker from very early in his life, probably was apprenticed maybe to a family member, and contributed to the success of the ship caulkers community. He was a president for a time in the 1840s of the Ship Caulkers Union, which helped them establish a monopoly on the ship caulking trade and gave them a lot of economic leverage and the ability to negotiate for wages. The union was crucial to that, and he was a member. And I'll be talking about a lot of those different things, but I first want to go into kind of the middle of his life in 1835. His name shows up in the diary of a man named Michael Shiner, who was an enslaved man living in Washington, D.C. and working at the Navy Yard throughout much of the 19th century. And in his diary, he includes this entry from 1835 where he talks about Israel. So what he says is, white workers got insulted at the orders that Commodore Hull issued, and every one of them struck and said they wouldn't work anymore. And at the same time, there were a colored man from Baltimore by the name of Israel Jones, a caulker by trade. He was the foreman caulker of those colored caulkers, and there were 15 or 20 of them here at that time, caulking on the Columbia, which is a ship, and the carpenters made all of them walk off. So what this entry tells us, and what I'm going to tell you a little bit more about, is that Israel Jones was a part of the story of the first race riot in Washington, D.C. in 1835, which is known as the Snow Riots. I don't have a lot of time in this talk. It's a big subject. You could probably have a presentation of your own on this topic and go for another half hour at least, but this is the short version. Um, the Washington, D.C. that Israel Jones came to in 1835 in that summer with his crew was far from peaceful. There was a lot of tension, especially in the Navy Yard. Both Black and white workers were employed there, but Black workers, both free and enslaved at the yard, they were paid less. And officials used this to keep down the wages of the white workers also, and stopping them from being able to negotiate or have any kind of bargaining power. It appears that the Caulkers came before this strike took place. It's not exactly known based on Shiner's diary. But the reason for the strike actually comes down to bringing lunches to work in the yard. One of the workers was caught smuggling out some stolen property in his lunch basket, and the commandant of the yard, Commodore Isaac Hull, he prohibited workers from bringing their lunches to the yard at the end of July of 1835. So a few days later, the white workers went on strike, partly because of this lunch rule, but also other things such as wages and working conditions. And they struck from July 31st to August 11th. It was very quiet. There were no concessions made on either side, and they had just kind of started returning to work at the yard in August 11th. A few things happened. A white abolitionist named Reuben Crandall was arrested for spreading, quote, incendiary literature, abolitionist literature throughout the Capitol. And 2 days earlier, Arthur Bowen, who was a young enslaved Black man, was arrested after he drunkenly entered his enslaver, his mistress's room with an axe. The incident was blamed on abolitionists from the North teaching Black people in Washington, D.C. to read and write and to bringing in ideas of freedom. But these developments gave an outlet for the strikers' anger, targeting free and enslaved Blacks and abolitionists. And this unsuccessful strike turned into a mob and a riot. After they went after Crandall and Bowen in the jail, were not successful, and then found a new target, a free Black restaurant owner named Beverly Snow. He was doing well. He had a restaurant on Pennsylvania, which was the heart of the city of Washington City at the time, named the Epicurean Eating House, and it was patronized by prominent politicians in Washington. But there were rumors that Snow had abolitionist materials in his house or his restaurant, and also there were rumors spread that he had made comments about the Navy Yard mechanics' wives and daughters. So Snow became their target, and luckily he escaped. But the mob destroyed his restaurant, and for 2 days terrorized the city, but specifically targeting Black Washingtonians and their property. So the question is, where was Israel Jones during this time? And the answer is, I don't know, but I know where he wasn't based on this correspondence between Commodore Hull and the Secretary of the Navy, Milan Dickerson. On the 14th of August, Commodore Hull wrote to the Secretary asking him if the Black Caulkers from Baltimore could be brought into the Navy Yard, because it seemed like the mob were coming in that direction, asking if he could bring them into the yard or discharge them so they could return to Baltimore. And Secretary Dickerson left them high and dry, as you can see there. He said, "I have to observe that for the present, I should think it were not best to admit the colored people into the Navy Yard at night." So I think they were concerned that if they brought Israel Jones and his crew into the yard, that could incite the rioters to attack the yard. And rather than give safe harbor to these people who had thought they brought to the city, they left them to fend for themselves, unfortunately. But luckily, the riot kind of cooled off even that day. The next day, the mechanics went back to work after federal troops were brought into the city. The city also tried to appease the white mob by passing an ordinance to limit the freedom of free and enslaved Black people. They weren't allowed to congregate at night, and they also limited liquor licenses for Black people. So there were a few rioters that were arrested, but none of the strikers' demands were actually met by the yard. I guess Commodore Hull did kind of soften the language of the lunch order, but it wasn't rescinded. So the purpose of bringing up this story, other than that it's part of Israel Jones's life, is that it tells us a story of the struggle that Black workers, and specifically the Caulkers, the conditions they had to work in, work with in this racist system, and being blamed for it as well. That the resentment for their lower wages, even though they were just as skilled, was against them rather than the people who chose not to pay them that. But they did find ways to survive and to thrive. And that brings us back to Baltimore. I had mentioned how they had a monopoly on the ship caulking trade in Baltimore. The same racial and labor dynamics existed in Baltimore as they did in the Washington Navy Yard. So that would not have been unfamiliar to Israel Jones. But they found ways to work within it and create a monopoly. From the late 1830s through about 1858, they did have a virtual monopoly on the trade. So much so that in newspapers, when the Caulkers were referred to, unlike most other times, they weren't referred to as colored or Negro. They were just referred to as Caulkers. I think it was understood. Everyone knew that caulking was a Black profession. But they, even though shipbuilders used antebellum racial laws to isolate free Black workers and use them as a buffer against labor turnover and bargaining, the Caulkers found a way to benefit. They negotiated with the shipbuilders and the shipbuilders guilds to have exclusive employment arrangements and would strike. They didn't. The white shipbuilders gained a reliable and also a skilled workforce, but it also helped them to discourage new shipbuilders from coming in and competing against them, but they relied on the Caulkers to boycott these yards. And so they held this monopoly from the 1830s through the 1850s, and that ended in 1858. And this could also be a whole nother talk, but a gang of know-nothing party, white workers used rioting and violence to break this monopoly. But even after that date, the Black Caulkers still comprised about 3/4 of Baltimore's workers. So a little bit more about Israel Jones and his background. As I mentioned, he was born around 1800. The first newspaper article I was able to find with him in it was in 1815. It's the one that you see on the right, where there's a notice that the Caulkers were asking for larger wages. There's still a little bit question in my mind whether this is Israel Jones, or perhaps it could have been a father with the same name, or maybe he was born before 1815 and was not 1815, born before 1800, which would put him at more of an age to be a full-fledged caulker and not an apprentice. But the ship caulking trade was something that was passed down by family members. Israel himself, he had 5 sons, and from what I've been able to find, at least 4 of them worked as caulkers, including, you can see in the upper article there, a son also named Israel Jones, who had run away in 1842. Probably he was apprenticed to him, And so then Israel is seeking him out and notifying people not to employ him because he was still apprenticed to Israel. I would love to know the story behind that ad as well, but don't have that full picture, unfortunately. Also, tied to the ship Caulkers houses, we know from census records and city directories that a ship caulker named Richard Jones lived in 614 Wolf Street from 1842 to 1850. And I believe that he could be a relative. He probably was a relative, if not a brother of Israel Jones. They were around the same age. Israel Jones named one of his sons Richard. And also later in life, they lived in the same area. So we have that tie where I assume, Richard, if it was his brother, was living at the Caulkers houses, then Israel would have been there, been in that house. But what I found from looking into it was Israel Jones, he did live in Fells Point. There's a directory entry from 1819 showing him live at what is now 610 Wolf Street. So that would have been one of the identical houses, just one north of our Caulkers houses. But by the 1830s, he had moved up to the Old Town area, north of Fells Point and Little Italy and Jonestown. And I've marked it here on the map that he did move around a bit from the 1830s through the 1870, which is the last entry for him. But he generally stayed in this area. Baltimore in the 19th century was not segregated. You would find white and black households on the same streets in the same areas, but there were enclaves of Black communities that were grouped together, and one of them was here in Old Town in the 1830s. Other ones were in Fells Point and also in Federalville. So some other things that I've found about Israel that I think gives a context to his life and the lives of the Caulkers was that even though they had these steady wages through their trade, it was precarious, that they were paid by the day. So if they were injured or ill or something happened, unexpected expenses, it could leave them in debt. And we see him in 1837 and 1844 applying for insolvency laws. What those are it was a law passed in 1805 that prior to that time, if you were in debt, you could be put in jail until you could pay it off. But these laws allowed someone who was in debt to, if they were a citizen of Maryland for 2 years, they could apply for these benefits of not going to jail and working to pay off their debts. This wasn't isolated to Israel. You can see also in the 1844 one, his brother was there as well, also in that notice. But the solution, there wasn't at this time government solution necessarily for anyone, let alone Black people. They created their own benevolent societies to help each other. So you can see here on the left, the Caulkers Union Beneficial Society sponsored a boat excursion, and that money was going to help them build a Caulkers Hall, which you can see they did. Just a couple months later in 1850, there was an ad for having a fair there. But these beneficial societies, the Black benevolent societies, they dated back to the 1780s, and were very common. A survey in northern states showed that they were the most common Black organizations, even more common than churches. And there were about 40 groups in Baltimore in 1835. So this wasn't something that was unique to the Caulkers. But what they did, they provided aid, kind of like an insurance to workers who were unemployed or were ill, could provide money for education. And the other part of this is that I think a difference between Black and white beneficial societies is that you have this component in Black communities where they were also there to aid people who were freed from slavery, adjusting to life outside of slavery, and needed help, and these societies could provide that they could provide a transition and help. And we see that in another Caulkers organization, the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, which you may have heard of. We know about that through Frederick Douglass's memoirs. And he talks about being allowed to be a part of this debating literary society, even though technically enslaved people were not allowed to join it, but he did. He met his wife, Anna Murray, through the society. It also helped him associate with other free Black people and stimulated a desire that was already there to be free, but it gave them that community that helped to be able to achieve freedom and the skills that he would use later on in life, oration and debating. We don't have a lot of information about the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society other than from Douglass's accounts. But it does tell us that the society met in the members, in the homes of its members. And it shows how important literacy was to the Caulkers community and Baltimore in general, the Black community in Baltimore. This is confirmed by the 2019 archaeological investigations completed at the Caulkers houses by the Herring Run Archaeology Project. They found a large number of slates and slate pencils at the Caulkers houses from the time period when the Black Caulkers lived there. That could have been related to the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, but at the very least, it confirms that the inhabitants of the houses were literate, could read and write, and that these activities, education, they were an important part and a large part of their daily lives. And it was something that was important to Black people in Baltimore as a whole during this period, the Antebellum period. As the 19th century went on, literacy rates were increasing in Baltimore through the different generations. You can see this in census records when we're looking at Israel Jones and his family. He and his wife could read and write, also Richard Jones and his family. And the 1850 census that we have of Israel shows that 3 of his sons were in school. And these were schools that were created by and for Black people, since they weren't allowed to attend white schools in Baltimore. I think another evidence of the importance of reading and writing was, you can see in this presentation, a lot of what I've been able to find is through newspapers, find things that were created by Israel Jones himself. The runaway ads for his son, and there was another one for an apprentice, as well as the Caulkers as a whole. They communicated with each other. They had notices of the excursions that they were doing, their fundraising efforts, events. Also, there are notices in the newspapers of strikes and wage demand increases. And I put this article up here, which, depending on the size of your screen, may be a little bit small, but this is from 1865. And so at this time, I think I mentioned before, we had the 1858 violence against the Caulkers. They continued to work in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. When white workers were coming back, there were renewed efforts to remove Black Caulkers from their trade, to prohibit them from working in the shipyards. And it was covered in the newspaper. There are a lot of articles back and forth from different groups about why they were doing it. And the Caulkers were able to participate in this by, printing their own appeal that you can see here. And I get one phrase I really liked out of this one. I feel like it's a great turn of phrase where they ask this question. They ask, then why should mechanical organizations that bear little or no relation to that of caulking arrest progress of commerce and send wafting on the sea of prejudice the business interests of Baltimore to other ports, because a few colored men in this little corner of creation have created business for themselves. And so they understood the importance of being able to participate in this civic kind of, I guess, discourse or argument that was going on, and being able to state their own side. Israel Jones died soon after this, around the end of 1870, 71. He would have, through this period, continued to see the struggle of the Caulkers to continue in their trade, but also would have seen the end of slavery, the chartering of the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company by fellow Black Caulkers, Isaac Myers and John W. Locks in 1868. And then soon before he died, also the ratification of the 15th Amendment and giving Black men voting rights. To end, right at the time here, I think of Israel Jones and other Black Caulkers as both ordinary and extraordinary. When I'm researching Israel's life, I'm seeing things that kind of are true of Black Baltimoreans' experiences, but they are extraordinary. The things that they were able to do, the place that they were able to create for themselves, the success, the monopoly that they had on the caulking trade, finding ways to create their community despite a racist system. And our mission is to continue this research, to continue to bring these stories to light and to tell them, and to help everyone know about the amazing history that we have here in Baltimore and in Fells Point particularly, with these ship caulkers. So I guess, well, there's briefly my works reference. And if you want to follow along, we do have Facebook and Instagram pages and are working soon to be able to also have a dedicated website for the ship caulkers houses. And so that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. And I certainly have questions. I'll ask one just to kick it off.
Okay.
And it's sort of, this was amazing research that you've done. And I have, as a historian, have questions about that. But also, I'm just curious, how will this research be used incorporated into the Caulkers houses after restoration? What are future plans? Because it's such rich history.
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to tell those stories at the house, find ways to bring in interpretive materials there. We don't have it set in stone, but I think, we do have the two houses, and we're, looking at having a space that kind of shows what I can speak, what the houses would have looked like at that time, but then also, include some interpretive materials. I think the other part, there's too much here to go in these tiny houses, but that's where I think also our website comes into play, where we can have those available online, have blog, have histories, talk about these individual people as we find out more about them, tell the individual stories. So I think, yeah, stay tuned. They're under construction now, so you can't go in, but just when anyone comes, remember that 9 or 10 people lived in these tiny houses. And when you stand in there and try to think one room up and down 9 people, it's a whole different, perspective about things. So we're excited for them to be more accessible soon for everyone to come.
Wonderful. I know, I'm excited. We have one question. Did the caulking work depend on whaling or change as a result of changes in the use of ships?
So, I mean, I think, what you see, and even it mentioned in that last newspaper article, was that they were talking about how people were bringing their ships from all over the world because they knew of the caulkers and they knew of the quality of work and wanted their ships to be caulked there. So there was, a lot coming in. There was trade, and so probably ships coming in to Baltimore for trade and other things would have been then having their ships repaired. But it also seems like people were bringing them specifically to Baltimore to be, retrofitted or worked on or built. So, and then the second part of the question, can you remind me what that was?
Yeah, here, I have it somewhere. Did caulking work change as a result of changes in the use of ships? And I would think maybe materials built using.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, as ships, were no longer wood as much, that changed, but there still were ship caulkers. I even found an article from the 1940s in the Baltimore Afro-American, where it was talking about how caulking was a dying trade, but there were people that were still employed. And also the apprenticeship I was talking about, it was still saying that, this person learned the trade from his father. So those skills, even though you hear less about it, were still being passed down. And, this article talked about how they had a nice home and a good life. So it was still a good, trade and profession, even through the, the 1940s and beyond. I am not as familiar with, what the caulking entailed. Probably the process changed, but I don't know those specifics for the later time. Yeah.
Absolutely. And do you know where caulkers in other cities mostly Black also?
At the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., they were primarily Black, but in other places it was not exclusively Black. So there were white caulkers in other cities. So it seems, as far as I can tell, Baltimore was a little bit of an anomaly, that, or maybe Baltimore, Washington, that it was exclusive to them, but it was not by any means, just a Black profession.
Interesting. Okay. And this is an interesting question. Were any of the ships that Black caulkers worked on involved in the slave trade?
I do not know the answer to that question. That would be a good research item to find out. I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but maybe, maybe even probably, but yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Would the 1940s caulkers have also learned other skills for work on ships once the need for caulking dwindled? Or would they have quit and learned other trades in an entirely different field?
I don't know the answer to that. I wasn't specifically researching that part. That's a great question too. I would assume that it's like any of these kind of trades or professions, that when they are no longer useful, then they find a way to morph into something else. But the focus for me right now is on the the ship caulkers period. So I haven't delved into that aspect of it.
So hopefully someone listening will pick up that. And
yes, please research and let me know. I would love to benefit from that knowledge.
Yeah, and so I have a question just about, you had this diary at the beginning of Michael Shiner, and that just seems like a needle in a haystack. How did you find that? And then maybe could you talk about your research a little bit? We had a question here about the state of digitizing newspapers published during the time of your research and that.
Thank goodness for digitization. Yeah, so honestly, I started out, I should make it more complicated, but I just Googled Israel Jones Caulker, and the Michael Shiner diary had been transcribed and was on the Navy History and Heritage Command website. And so that took me there and got me started down that path. So that was actually a super easy find. So thank you to the Naval History and Heritage Command for that. And then the question was just research generally. It's a lot of newspaper articles and looking census records, looking at city directories. I spent a lot of time trying to find the 1850 census showed that Israel Jones owned real property. And so I was trying to find that and was not successful in uncovering that. So anyone out there who wants to look into that also can help me out, and maybe I missed it. But I mean, I think the thing that you find, which is similar to even what we hear about now with census records and the underrepresentation of minority groups, that was happening then. Israel Jones, I was able to find him some years, but not others, other family members as well, that those records aren't always there. And I'm sure there are still more repositories to look into to find things, but you know, these aren't the Frederick Douglasses of the world. Their lives weren't documented to that extent, and so it can be a lot of looking for pieces and putting them together and extrapolating and making educated guesses about what it meant for their life. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. I just said wonderful, and thank you so much, Sarah, for being here. We're at the end of our time, but this presentation has been recorded and will be on the Baltimore Architecture Foundation's YouTube channel next week. So thank you again, Sarah.
Great, thank you for having me. Okay, bye.
Thank you.